You wake up to silk that smells faintly of other men's sweat. The perfumed incense from the lanterns above burns your nostrils, too sweet, too thick. Outside, the garden rustles with cherry blossoms, petals drifting like memories of a world you no longer belong to. But here, inside the private quarters of a daimyo's estate, the scent of flowers cannot mask the rot beneath the surface. You are 14, perhaps 15. Your thighs ache from last night. Your chest is wrapped tightly in linen to flatten what is not there, and the silence is worse than any scream. You are not a guest here. You are not a man. You are a possession. The other concubines do not speak much, not unless spoken to. One is missing today. No one says his name. That is how it works here. The beauty of the court is built upon vanishing boys. You were taken from your village 3 winters ago, promised apprenticeship and meals. What you received was silk, training, and the kiss of a blade if you ever refused. What follows is not simply your story. It is the hidden truth of a forgotten system, beautiful on the outside, monstrous within. Welcome to the world of the wakashu, the boy concubines of feudal Japan. And this is only the beginning. Before we journey into these forgotten tales of survival and suffering, if you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, please consider liking this video and hitting that subscribe button for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The year is 1567. Japan is fractured, a nation divided by steel and ambition. The Sengoku period, an age of warlords, and chaos devours the countryside. Daimyo lords rise and fall with the stroke of a katana. Castles burn, rice fields flood with blood. Yet even in these times, a peculiar elegance thrives within the fortified walls of noble households. These are places where the arts bloom, ink painting, flute music, calligraphy. But beneath the surface, these citadels of beauty conceal unspeakable transactions. You were born in a fishing village outside of Ise Bay. Your mother sold dried fish, and your father mended nets until he was conscripted to die for a minor lord. Hunger lived in your home more often than laughter. You remember your little brother crying from emptiness, while your mother stared at the fire as if she could conjure food with her eyes. So when the recruiter came dressed in lacquered armor, offering coins, security, a future, you believed him. Or maybe your mother did. "He has a delicate face," she said softly, eyes darting away from yours. "He will live better than we ever could." You were taken with 3 other boys. They put you on a palanquin, not a horse. The journey to the estate was slow, heavy with incense smoke and the constant clink of ceremonial charms. You were told to bathe every day. You were taught how to sit perfectly still. You were taught silence. They plucked your eyebrows. They painted your lips. They renamed you. The servants called you Taki, a name meaning waterfall. "So pretty when it moves," the head servant had whispered. They said it like a compliment. You later understood it was a warning. Wakashudo, the way of the youth, was the name they gave the tradition. A practice as old as the shogunate, formalized in samurai codes and romanticized in court poetry. Male love, male beauty, the warrior who trains and beds the boy. A noble path, they told you, an honor. But that is not what you felt that first night. He was a retainer of your lord, perhaps in his 30s, armored fingers rough on your hips, breath heavy with sake and power. He did not speak to you afterward. You bled onto the silk. You did not cry. By your 2nd year, you had perfected the art of the bowed head. You had learned to make tea without trembling. You had learned how to smile when your body flinched. This is how you survived. You began to understand the hierarchy. You were lower than the women, because at least they had roles. You were not quite a man, and no longer a boy. The nobles called you beautiful, but never by your real name. And in the quiet spaces, the ones between duty and violation, you heard the others whisper, "When we age out, if we're lucky, they send us to temple. If we're not, we vanish." One tried to run. A boy named Kaoru. They hung him by his wrists in the plum orchard for a day, then he simply never came back. You stopped asking questions after that. But curiosity still lingers. Even as you kneel on cold tatami floors, you begin to see patterns. The same men, the same words, the same broken looks. And somewhere deep inside, a question grows. Is this truly the life of a noble companioner? Is this something else entirely? What became clearer with each passing season was that this was not tradition, it was machinery, and you were just one of its moving parts. The system was built on silence, maintained by ritual, and fueled by hierarchy. Everything had a place, and you Takiware placed somewhere beneath dignity, but just above visibility. You were ornament, a living accessory. Your existence served the aesthetic hunger of the elite. Wakashu boys, like you, were trained to walk with balance, to sing in high tones, to pour wine just so, to endure pain with a smile. The system called it cultivation. The truth was grooming. The practice of using boy concubines in Japan had deep roots among the warrior class. It was both an expression of power and a mechanism of loyalty. A samurai who took a boy into his care, his bed, and his trust, believed he was shaping that boy into a mirror of his values. But behind closed screens, it had nothing to do with honor. It was hunger. You were assigned to Lord Fujihara's inner residence at the age of 15. He did not speak often, but when he did, it was in commands. You remember how his hand rested on your throat during your first winter together, not enough to choke, just enough to remind you he could. His chamber reeked of camellia oil, fermented rice, and skin. He liked to watch you undress slowly, folding each layer of kimono as if he were disassembling a shrine. Some boys broke early. One from Omi bit off the tip of his tongue and died in the bathhouse. Another scratched at his own face until they tied his hands for a week. You learned to survive by forgetting. Forget your village. Forget your name. Forget the feeling of your body before it belonged to someone else. The old nursemaids called you Nyobo, as if you were one of the women's servants, though your uniform was always slightly off. You wore white face paint for certain ceremonies. Your hair was kept long, tied high, parted in the middle like a courtesan's. You were to exist in a permanent state of becoming, never fully a man, never fully a woman, never allowed to age without punishment. Punishment came in subtler forms too. Meals withheld, cold floors in winter, silence. Being passed over for an outing and knowing it was not because you were spared, but because someone else was wanted more. Those in power spoke of harmony, of divine order, of Bushido. But what order allows children to be used as gifts? You once saw a lord give a 12-year-old to a general as thanks for a battle won. The boy was wrapped like a scroll and presented with poetry. There was no escape. Every corridor had ears. Every guard knew your face. Your very presence was part of the Lord's image, and you were expected to enhance it, not tarnish it with rebellion. The rules were unwritten, but you absorbed them all the same. Do not weep after. Do not refuse an invitation. Do not speak first. Do not look too long into any man's eyes unless he wants you to. And if he does, never look away. Your body was not your own, and neither were your thoughts. You began to dream in silence, even your fantasies bound in ritual. But the worst was not the violation. It was the applause, the nods, the poems written about your beauty, the way even the kindest court visitors looked at you like something carved rather than born. As Taki matured, so too did the invisible cage around him tighten, and with it came a deeper understanding of just how meticulously the system ensured obedience and erased identity. But even as Taki's body adjusted to the routines of his captivity, his mind began to fracture in quiet, nearly invisible ways. The system worked precisely because it did not feel like punishment, not at first. It draped itself in silks, in ritual, in beautiful lies. The term wakashudo masked the core truth. This was state, sanctioned, culturally veiled abuse. The same elite who wrote verses about cherry blossoms and impermanence also organized weekly visits to the boys' quarters. The same officials who upheld Confucian order and Shinto harmony kept ledgers of which concubines had been used and by whom. When Taki turned 16, he was no longer the newest. A younger boy named Masaru arrived from the northern mountains. Thin and wide-eyed, Taki was instructed to help prepare him for his duties. That meant teaching him to hold the lacquer tray correctly. That meant helping him bathe. That meant watching his face the morning after Masaru was first summoned, seeing that same shattered silence in his eyes, the one Taki could no longer see in his own reflection. You became part of the machine then, not by desire, but by survival. You told yourself it was better to guide the boy gently than let the system break him with its usual cruelty. You believed that, for a time. But something inside you decayed every time you said, "It's better if you don't resist." Resistance, when it came, never looked like fire. It looked like small choices. Some boys refused to speak, others fasted until they collapsed. One scribbled vulgar poetry on the paper walls in blood. The punishments were efficient. The worst was isolation, being locked for days in the cedar closet, dark and silent, where time dissolved and the scent of wood turned nauseating. Taki tried once too, not to escape the estate, but to send a message to a visiting monk. He slipped a note under the monk's prayer mat. "Help me, I am not a guest, I am not free." But the monk never responded. Instead, Taki was summoned to Lord Fujihara's chamber that same night. The lesson was physical, a broken rib, a slit lip, no questions asked. In the aftermath, Taki understood something even more terrifying than the violence itself. The system did not need chains or whips to hold you. It used shame, ceremony, hierarchy, and most of all, invisibility. You could scream in that estate, and no one would call it a scream. They would call it a ritual. He began to count things compulsively, his steps across the garden stones, the number of breaths he could take before flinching, the days since someone had used his real name. It was not strategy, it was survival. It gave him the illusion of control. The hypocrisy of it all was staggering. The same Lord who pressed a blade to your chest in the evening would wax poetic in the morning about balance and virtue. The men who made you wash their feet were celebrated in public as patrons of the arts. Their calligraphy graced temple walls, their crimes were never recorded. You wonder how many others lived like you, their stories erased under ink scrolls and flower arrangements. You wonder how many of those pretty poems about loyal boys were written with blood still fresh on the tatami. There were moments of reprieve, brief flickers of solidarity. Masaru once held your hand under the futon, wordless. Another boy, Kenta, gave you a carved wooden bird before he was reassigned to Kyoto and never seen again. These were not revolutions, they were acknowledgements. proof that you were still human. And yet, each year chipped away at your selfhood. You watched the younger boys arrive, and you began to mimic the gestures of your own captors. You smiled when you were meant to. You reassured when needed. You kept Masaru from starving himself, not out of kindness, but because you feared his disappearance would draw more attention. You were not free, but you were not broken. Not yet. What followed next would make clear that survival alone was not enough. Because for those trapped inside this silken nightmare, the only thing worse than pain was becoming numb to it. Meanwhile, outside the gates of the estate, Japan was transforming, and yet, for boys like Taki, no transformation would come. The late 16th century saw the ascent of Oda Nobunaga, and with him, a consolidation of power that threatened to reshape the fractured daimyo domains. Jesuit missionaries arrived from Portugal, and Christianity began to infiltrate the spiritual order of Japan's elite. But even as the warriors debated divine right and foreign gods, no outsider ever challenged what happened inside the silken walls of noble homes. No missionary wrote of the boys gifted like vases. No samurai scroll condemned the practice of wakashudo. It was too convenient, too beautifully disguised. The system's horror lay not only in its cruelty, but in its normalization. Court painters depicted wakashu in elegant poses, with smooth faces and downcast eyes. One artist, Kano Eitoku, even immortalized a famous boy lover in a 6-panel screen, surrounded by clouds and cranes. Such images served a dual purpose: to aestheticize the suffering and to erase it entirely. To the outside world, Taki was not a victim. He was art. Lord Fujihara grew more brutal with age. His demands became unpredictable. One winter, he ordered Taki and 2 others to dance for a visiting general, wearing only red cords and silver bells. The general clapped. That night, Masaru did not return to the sleeping chamber. Taki found his slipper in the snow the next morning. That was the breaking point. It was not rage. It was not bravery. It was despair that finally hollowed something in Taki's chest and made space for action. The boy who once begged a monk for help now took steel from the kitchen. He did not plan a murder. He planned an ending. He returned to Lord Fujihara's chamber, bowed, presented the tea, then quietly placed the blade against his own palm beneath the sleeve. It was not meant to be a spectacle. He merely wanted blood to appear. Wanted someone, anyone, to notice it and ask, "Are you all right?" No one did. Later that night, when Taki collapsed in the bathhouse from blood loss, the servants panicked. They whispered of curses, of bad omens. The head steward beat one of the newer boys for not noticing sooner. Lord Fujihara summoned the estate physician, but never spoke Taki's name. For days, he drifted in and out of fever dreams. In them, his mother stood by a river, holding dried fish. Masaru whispered lullabies he had never known. And Kenta's carved bird flew from his palm and shattered against the moon. When he awoke, he was not punished. He was ignored. Silence, the cruelest sentence of all. In time, he was moved from the Lord's quarters. Not out of mercy, but practicality. He was no longer pleasing. A new boy had arrived from Aizu, with softer skin and clearer eyes. Taki became a servant in the kitchen, where the concubines who had aged out peeled radishes in silence. He was 17. And what of the society that allowed this? It continued for centuries. Even after the Edo period solidified control and Tokugawa laws bound the nation in strict moral codes, the practice of keeping beautiful boy attendants persisted under other names, other masks. Monks in certain sects adopted the tradition. Some scholars romanticized it as the way of refined companionship. But the boys themselves never wrote histories. They were never asked to. The system functioned not only because powerful men wanted it to, it survived because everyone else looked away. Taki's worst moment was not the assault. It was not the silence after Masaru's disappearance. It was not even the night he bled in the bathwater. It was the day he was forgotten, when another boy bowed in his place, and no one noticed the difference. To understand how Taki's story ends, and what becomes of those devoured by systems that wear beauty like armor, we must now look at what remained of him, and of the world that used him. He never escaped. That truth must be spoken first. Taki lived the remainder of his youth in the servant wing of the estate, scrubbing floors he once glided across in silk. He served the very guests who once summoned him with a snap of their fingers. No one ever addressed him directly again. Not because they hated him, because he was inconvenient. Some said he became mute, though more likely, he simply stopped offering anything that might be turned into pain. Others remember that he carved birds out of wood scraps and left them by the koi pond. No one knows what happened to the one he kept for himself. At 19, he was sent to a Buddhist temple in the mountains. A gift, repurposed for ritual. Monasteries, too, had long histories of wakashudo, but this temple was old and poor. There were no nobles there, just silence, prayers, and cold stone floors. The monks said he rarely spoke, but he prayed with diligence. He cleaned without being asked. He watched the trees closely. He had no name, only his tasks. And then, in the winter of his 20th year, he stopped rising for morning chant. A younger monk found him frozen beside the temple gate, seated upright as if waiting for permission to leave. There is no record of a funeral, only a line in a temple scroll. The servant known as Taki passed in the third snow. The estate where he once lived was destroyed in the early Edo period, during a reorganization of land and titles. Lord Fujihara's name faded into obscurity, his descendants absorbed by marriage into another clan. The practice of wakashudo was never officially outlawed. It simply became unfashionable, later censored, then forgotten. But forgetting is not healing. The legacy of boys like Taki lives on in the silences of historical record, in the blank margins where their stories should be, in the sanitized poems that praise their grace but omit their screams. And if this history feels distant, abstract, ancient, we must ask ourselves why systems that exploit youth and erase victims still echo in our present world, why bodies are still sold behind veils of tradition, why abuse wrapped in beauty continues to pass as culture. Taki was not a myth. He was a child. He was taken, trained, used, and discarded. And though he died in silence, we can choose not to look away. We remember him now not as a footnote, not as an ornament, but as a voice buried beneath centuries of shame. And in remembering, we restore what the system tried to erase, his humanity.